I am Shane Schoolman, and I am CEO and co-founder of Mycology Farm, also known as CWO, which is the Chief Wizard Officer. My background is in ecology and evolutionary biology in a very indirect pathway working with soil science. You learn that a healthy teaspoon of soil or gram of soil has over 1 billion microbes in it. And, that's archaea, bacteria, protozoa, and then this whole queendom, if you will, of fungi. And that's pretty much what projected me into the space. But a lot of pathways in my life led to fungi. But that was one of them was learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I like to deconstruct and learn very complex puzzles, and one of those puzzles ended up being cultivation. So that brought me into the fungal world, and then understanding how I'm able to learn myself. And you can do that a couple different ways. If I simplified it, you can have information presented to you a certain way, and that can induce learning. Another way is to chemically induce learning. So that would be, your diet, right? So you can consume, your brain is one thing, but your stomach is your second brain, right? So if you have a healthy diet, probiotics, they can produce something called, nerve growth factor, which can relate to learning. And one of the most potent versions of nerve growth factor generator would be the mushroom lion's mane. So a couple different avenues kept leading to fungi. And that's pretty much what got me here into that world. If I had to get into the weeds of, the anatomy of fungi, it's got a body and it's got a fruit. Just like an apple tree has the tree, it's got the bark, it's got leaves, and it has a fruit. It's an apple. So fungi are very similar. A group of fungi are very similar in that regard. There's an estimated 1.5 to 2 million unique species of fungi on planet Earth, estimated, and a small subset of these actually produce fruiting bodies. And lion's mane is one of these. So there's two parts of that equation. There is the fruit, and then there's the body of the fungus. Right now, there is a lot of debate on the benefits of using mycelium versus using the fruiting body. And I would say I'm not in either camp, but the research, what I have read, pushes us towards the fruiting body, though the fruiting body consists of 71 unique compounds, one of these being the nootropic variety. The mycelium also has one of these compounds, but a subset of the amount of compounds. It's far less variety that exists in the mycelium versus the fruit body. And that's a big argument for why you would consume the mycelium of lion's mane versus the fruit, because of erinacines, specifically this compound called, or a class of compounds called erinacines. Research that's been published states that it only exists in the mycelium. So this perpetuates this idea that the common consumer should be consuming the myceliated form of mushroom, the body of it, to get the nootropic compounds. I do not agree with this. Recent research has shown multiple different times that the fruiting body not only has a wider array of compounds in it, but a vast majority of these are nootropic compounds that exist only in the fruiting body. And then you can get down to potency, which is another avenue of why I got into the fungal realm. I'm a conscious consumer. In the nootropics world, I would consume these capsules, these lion's mane capsules, and I read the label. I do a little bit of legwork to understand what's going into my body, and then I realize very quickly that this capsule that I'm taking is something called mycelium, which is the body of the fungus, and it's not even extracted. It's just dehydrated mycelium grown on grain, usually rice or millet or something related to that. And that's what honestly perpetuated me into creating my own product, and that's what got me into mycology specifically, was to create a high-quality, potent product that was therapeutic. Because a vast majority of products that are currently on the shelf, one, aren't even grown in the US, two, aren't even extracted, and aren't really the right part of the mushroom. And the reason for that is cost. When you can do something faster and for a fraction of the cost, and you can make profit because your consumer base doesn't know the difference, capitalism isn't always about doing what's right. Unfortunately, that's where we're at. In regards to lion's mane, this is how I think about it. If I had to break it down to just the everyday consumer, so your entire body is made up of neurons. They communicate through electrical signals. The biggest neuronal mass that we consider ourselves to have is the brain, But your stomach, your heart, your lungs, your entire body is literally made up of neurons, and they need to communicate. Sometimes they communicate through electrical signals, and sometimes these signals become dampened, damaged, or broken, or maybe they never communicated at all. And through clinical research, as well as benchtop studies, they've been able to use lion's mane, specifically lion's mane extracts, and see the repair, to be able to repair these pathways, create new neuronal pathways, and kind of brighten them up. I think specifically in regards to the myelin sheath. And that's what, I guess, when I think about nerve growth factor, it's this idea of what promotes their neuronal repair and formation. And it's these compounds that you would consume generally, which is in lion's mane. To sum that up, I guess, the analogy I like to use is, let's say you come to my booth, we're at the farmer's market, and I'm an apple farmer. And you ask me, hey, Shane, give me your best apples. And I hand you a bunch of bark. One, that isn't what you asked for. And two, it's not the most beneficial part of the organism. But that's kind of what's going on at mass scale in the mushroom industry right now, the supplement mushroom industry, I should clarify. The elevator pitch for what Mycolove Farm is. We're a 100% vertically integrated organic mushroom farm based out of Colorado. And the vertically integrated part sometimes gets missed, but what that means is that we literally do everything. We grow the mushroom, we process the mushroom, we extract the mushroom, we bottle, we label. We do everything from A to Z. And the reason behind that is so we can control and maintain a high quality product all the way from start to finish to the end consumer. And there's a large amount of challenges that go into that process. One easy one is cost and education. The consumer market doesn't necessarily understand the depths of product quality right now. So we're doing a lot of work to, educate, which goes against our profit margin, really, because we spend more time to educate the consumer to help them understand what a high quality product looks like. Because again, we could be sourcing from overseas, we could be growing the mycelium rather than the fruit, we could be saving a lot of money in this process. But one thing that's bothered me in the industry is, hey, hearing a story of someone at a party and they're like, hey, I tried lion's mane and I didn't get any benefit. They consider it to be snake oil. And they're not questioning the product they consumed is the issue. Because we have a larger amount of stories from our customer base from benefit, not only from lion's mane, but from reishi, turkey tail, and cordyceps, each tackling a different part. So cost is a big issue. Education is a challenge. And I also, when I started down this path into this company, my background was really, my skill set was in the lab, was, going out in the wild, cloning these mushrooms, propagating them back out, and then growing them to fruition and really dialing in that process. Because again, I love puzzles and I draw a box. That's what the world of ecology really is you draw a box and you understand all of the inputs and outputs and you understand how everything in that box works together. And that was what I assumed I would be doing for the business. And plus I was passionate about it. So I had an assumption what I would, or at least I had a thought of what I'd be doing for the business. But in reality, what a CEO does for the business is not those things. There's everything from marketing to sales to spending weeks to find the most sustainable, cost-effective label for a tincture bottle, right? We work very hard to try to source everything as we can from the U.S. when possible. And then, that goes into product formulation, understanding the customer experience, social media. I mean, there's all of these things that go into operating a business. Taxes. I never thought I would spend as much time as I had to understand taxes for businesses, which isn't a problem necessarily, but again, I didn't understand that's what I was getting into when I was going to work and run an organic mushroom farm. Organic certification, that was a very long and tedious process as well, because I was very happy to learn that it is a very tedious process, a very rules-oriented and quality-oriented process to understand that if you have this certification, it is a big deal. Not only are you sourcing all of your ingredients organically, hopefully non-GMO, but you are abiding by those rules and regulations. But yeah, hopefully that kind of sums up kind of some of the challenges. I mean, then you in the everyday life of just, you have the farm, that's a whole aspect. Then you have post-production, so doing the extractions. Then you have distribution, and each one of those has a whole complex array of multifaceted parts that help it operate, and then figuring out the optimum way of doing each one of those. So the farm itself can be challenging because you are growing something organically in a very controlled environment, and it's always been crazy to me that you can just walk out to any natural spot and find mushrooms. I mean, that's not crazy. What's crazy is that you can't do that in a very highly controlled environment. Right now in the mushroom industry, it's not about, there's no probiotic farming, if you will. You're not working with the other elements to grow mushrooms. You're actually removing all of the other elements to grow mushrooms. But that's also has genetic implications as well. So when you find a mushroom out in the wild, it's far different than a farmed mushroom grown in a very highly controlled, sterile environment. The genes that are used during an outside grow life cycle are used to help protect itself, which is really interesting and important for the mushroom sense. Because when you grow it inside, it doesn't have to use that energy to protect itself, to fight off pests, bacteria, whatever it's going to take it down. It can then use that energy for yield and potency. So there is a difference between wild harvested and cultivated mushrooms. It's very different, genetically at least. And if you broke down the mushroom, it's usually difference in the potency and the yield you get as well. So there's different ways to get the most medicinal benefit, optimized way of getting the most medicinal benefit out of a mushroom, right? There's always going to be a more optimized way. And I guess I like to start from the worst way to consume a mushroom medicinally, specifically. Not for sustenance necessarily, but for the medicinal compounds. And what's important to understand before I go into it is that the mushroom itself is made of a biopolymer. We can call it nature's plastic, if you will. It's a very strong, hardy molecular structure called chitin. And some people might know this word. It's what crustaceans are made of and what the exoskeleton of insects are made of. And the human body, at its current stage in evolution, doesn't have any need to break down crab shell or insect exoskeleton. So we don't have the enzymes that can readily digest that very well, or if at all. So arguably the worst way to consume a mushroom medicinally is a raw, fresh mushroom. And the reason for that is, again, the human body can't readily digest chitin, and the compounds that we're getting to the bottom of to be functional, if you will, or medicinal, one specifically is called beta-glucans. It's a polysaccharide. This polysaccharide is specifically locked up in the chitin, and you have to break down the chitin to get that benefit out of it. And your body, again, can't really break that down. So getting mushrooms in your system is one thing, but to get a medicinal therapeutic dose of a mushroom, that's another thing. And again, a more optimized way, I guess the best optimized way to consume a mushroom medicinally is an extraction, right? So the goal of the extraction is to kind of do the pre-digestion of the chitin and remove it completely from the equation. So all you're left over with are bioavailable compounds. And these are dependent per mushroom, but in the functional space, one compound that's universal is the beta-glucan mushroom. And this is considered an immunomodulator. And we can go into that a little bit later. But there's a big gap between an extract and a raw mushroom. And that's what you see on the marketplace. You see freeze-dried or dehydrated ground-up mushrooms in capsules. That's better than a raw mushroom, but not by much. It's basically a very expensive fiber supplement. And then you can do different grades of extractions. And it gets, more and more optimized from there, depending on the quality of extraction. Beta-glucans, specifically beta-D-glucans, come in different forms. It can get pretty complex, but we usually break them down into two, 1,3 and 1,6. And there are other linkages out there, but we're not really well versed in measuring those in a laboratory test right now. We're mainly just measuring beta-glucans and something called alpha-glucans. And we can go into the alpha versus beta thing as well. But to break down beta-glucans specifically, they're considered immunomodulatory compounds, and they exist in different ratios in each mushroom. I never want to be absolutist, so I honestly don't know if it's in all basidiomycete mushrooms, which is a certain group of fungi. But the functional mushrooms that we all know and take today, basically all of them they all have beta-glucans in them. That's oyster mushrooms, that's reishi, that's lion's mane, that's cordyceps, that's turkey tail. I'm pretty sure it's pretty much all of them have at least this compound in it. But again, it can get super complex. A mushroom like reishi can have 400 to 500 unique compounds in it, and beta-glucans being one. But it's a very important compound, and it does its magic by lodging itself in your gut lining, and it's able to modulate your immune system. So it's built into the name. Immunomodulatory literally just means it modulates your immune system, and that could ramp it up or down based on what your body really needs. Beta-glucans, in short, are immunomodulatory compounds that ramp your immune system up or down based on what it needs. If it's underactive, it can ramp it up. If it's overactive, it can dial it down. And what does that really mean? So, macrophages, T cells, all of the compounds that your body uses as an immune defense is what the beta-glucan can modulate and promote. But to get that benefit, it's a compound that needs to build up in your system over time. So that's why it's important in the functional mushroom space to get the medicinal benefit is to consume mushrooms at a therapeutic level on a daily basis for a long duration of time. You can't get fit by working out once a year, right? You have to build kind of a routine, and it needs to be in your system on a regular basis. And when you're talking about extracts versus mushrooms, the next best way to consume a mushroom for its functional sense is cooking it. And there's a deep evolutionary reason for that as well. I'm sure people, maybe they don't understand, but fire was a huge promoter of our brain size, and there's a deep evolutionary history with fire, and it ties into mushrooms as well. That to cook the mushroom, it breaks down the chitin and alleviates and kind of allows these medicinal compounds to be freely available by the human gut. So that's why oysters are super beneficial for the immune system, and lion's mane can be a functional mushroom as well as a gourmet mushroom. So, but to get the most benefit, to go back to the reason of this, get the optimized benefit of a mushroom for its functional sense is through an extraction. And why that is because if you cook a mushroom, there's too many unknowns. How high is the heat? Are the compounds you're extracting heat tolerant? Are you using water? Are they water-soluble compounds? And are they volatile? Which means the fire was just basically going to evaporate them into the atmosphere. And another class of compounds that we talk about in the mushroom space are triterpenoids. These are the volatile kind of flavors, if you will. It's what gives reishi that bitter flavor. But these are only generally soluble in alcohol. So that's why if you do an extraction and you understand what's in the mushroom, you can use chemistry and alchemy, if you will, to kind of extract those compounds out, remove the chitin completely, and have a higher bioavailable, highly medicinal product versus cooking. Though getting your mushrooms in your diet, whether you're cooking them or you're taking an extract, is a move in the right direction. I think if you don't have the access to high quality potent extracts, the next best way is to do it yourself by doing a tea. Cordyceps works very well. Cordycepin comes out fairly well in water. The beta-glucans, they're water soluble. So using a hot water decoction or making a tea, just using a French press and then grinding the mushroom up and soaking it in that hot water for a duration of time will extract medicinal compounds. But again, there's always a more optimized way of getting a higher and higher potency. And I guess what I mean by that is instead of needing a gram or 5 grams of lion's mane, maybe you need a fraction of that if it's a higher quality extract. I get really paranoid about my inability to know something to a T, so I can maybe touch on that. But I think I don't know the exact time frames. The deep evolutionary history with fire is, I think it's the human's brain size, I believe at least doubled due to the use of fire. And really what fire did for us is release very important compounds that were trapped in food. And that allowed our body to take it up, which is this other word we use called bioavailability. So mushrooms, I would say, is a good example, is like when I was talking about before about how these compounds that are sort of locked in the mushroom aren't really bioavailable. They're not really readily uptaken by the human body. And if they are, it's at a minimal amount. Now, when you can increase that bioavailability with the use of fire or heat. So most of the extractions that you see on the marketplace, there is some sort of heat involved. And then usually you need some sort of solvent. So that's going to be your water or your alcohol. You can use other solvents, but they're generally not that safe for human consumption, but they're still used. But yeah. But I think that was, I want to say like 200, 300,000 years ago is when the brain size grew to the extent that it did in a very rapid amount of time. It revolutionized our day, right? So we weren't tied to the sun anymore. And there's this deep rooted understanding of fire. I mean, for me, it might sound a little spiritual, if you will, but if I sit in front of a fire, it's sort of my TV. It's fascinating. It draws you in. It's complex. And it's simple at the same time. But our days were usually tied to the sun. And then by using fire, we were able to extend that day by 6 or more hours. And we did a lot of things during that time that really helped the human population evolve, whether that was through food or storytelling, communicating, using verbal noises with our mouths to make sense of the world. I don't know if vocalizing and using words necessarily is tied to fire, but the use of fire has definitely propelled the use of words to where they are today, for sure. Yeah, do I think that over the last 5,000 years, the day-to-day diet has changed? Absolutely. It's hard to know the evolutionary history of humans, and we have to use what data that we can. And that traces back, 50,000, 100,000. It goes back pretty far. And the diet of, let's say, 5,000 years ago is completely different than today, obviously. Processed foods. We didn't have the ability to process foods, if you will. I think, the most complex storage device that we would have had at that time was probably salt and fermentations, using probiotic cultures to keep food good for a prolonged amount of time. And then as of today, you have a lot of science on how to prepare food a certain way and how to process food a certain way to make it last literally forever. You have the Twinkie, right? This thing, I believe, will never expire, whereas something that's not processed has an expiration date. And usually we try to prevent that by trapping it in nitrogen or using something like citric acid or just some other process that will help prolong the life of that food. And I don't actually know what that did to the human diet health-wise necessarily, but if I speak for myself, I definitely feel better when I don't eat a lot of processed foods. So personally, I think it makes a huge difference in my diet. We grow. That's one thing about our farm is that, again, what I said earlier is there's a lot of mushrooms, right? There's up to 1.5 to 2 million unique species of them. And they're not all fruit-bearing mushrooms, but we've named maybe 10% of that, and of that, we've maybe worked with 70. And what's interesting in the evolutionary sense, in the genetic sense, is that species that are closely related generally had the same genetic pathway to produce the same compounds, right? So a sister species of reishi or sister species of reishi had a common ancestor that had the compounds that Ganoderma lucidum, the well-known red reishi, has today. So ganoderic acid or the beta-glucan, right? The sister species also have that genetic capability to produce those compounds. So what we do and what we focus on is acquiring native to North American varieties of all these mushrooms. So there is reishi that grows in our backyard. It's not Ganoderma lucidum, but it's a close relative of red reishi. The ones that we specifically grow, we do grow red reishi, Ganoderma lucidum, but we also grow Ganoderma polychromum, which is a West Coast reishi, and we grow Ganoderma multipileum, which is antler reishi. That one's not necessarily native to North America, but that one's an interesting mushroom in itself. Just the aesthetics of the antler formations, or people refer to it as sort of a coral-esque looking mushroom. Reishi is a very interesting mushroom. In traditional Chinese medicine, one of the first mushrooms you learn about is red reishi, and its adaptogenic ability. And adaptogenic is just fancy language for helping your immune system adapt to its environment. Yeah, adaptogenics became really prevalent in, I think, World War II with Russia. They were very interested in how to prevent soldiers from ramping up or down based on adrenaline levels. I mean, if you're a soldier and you experience warfare and gunfire specifically, your adrenaline's going to boost. So your anxiety level goes up, your adrenaline goes up. But unfortunately, after that, there's a dip. Now, what I guess most people were interested in was how to maintain kind of a level throughout that experience. And the word adaptogenics was born. And they specifically looked at Schizandra, and there was a tribal community there that used Schizandra for similar reasons, and night vision, I believe, which was very interesting. I don't know if that's accurate, if that's true, or not, if it actually helps produce night vision or not. But reishi is considered considered a superior adaptogen above ginseng, and it has this ability to help your immune system as well as your anxiety system kind of level out and not have too much of an extreme up or down. And reishi is, known as the elixir of life, or lingzi, the 10,000-year mushroom. It's been consumed over thousands of years for longevity. It's considered the mushroom of immortality. It really helps center an individual from the heavens and below. But interestingly enough, it also helps, regulate the body. This word adaptogen. It helps the individual's anxiety levels, which can lead to lessened stress levels, and it can also help with sleep. On the immune sense, one thing that stood out to me was it helps assist the p53 pathway. And the p53 pathway, the best way that I like to explain it in simple terms, is a genetic pathway that controls armored guards in your cells. So these armored guards can be looked at as bouncers, and they let things pass or they don't. And if you have a viral cell, a bacterial cell, tumor cell, cancer cell, whatever it is, if they're on their guard, they're able to prevent this cell or this item from entering the cell and infecting it. And it's how we get viral infections, how we get bacterial infections, how we get tumor cells, and the growth of them is these guards let them through. And what reishi has been looked at and is known for traditionally is kind of helping support those armored guards to help prevent, I consider reishi the preventative mushroom, right? You pay the reishi doctor at the end of the year for not getting sick, kind of thing. Yeah, oysters have less poetic storyline to them, unfortunately. I think it's up and coming, though. I think I have more of a modern science focus on the oyster rather than like an ethnomycological association like I would for reishi, like this historical backsetting for oyster I'm not familiar with. But there are many oysters. There's oysters for every season, and they're on every continent pretty much. But you have, your OG white oyster, Pleurotus austriatus. You have your pink oyster, your Pleurotus dejamour. You have local mushrooms, oysters here in Colorado. We have a clone from Waterton Canyon that one of our COO had taken himself, and we grow that out today. It's a Phoenix oyster. And blue oyster, elm oyster, you have all these different oysters, and they grow at different points, different places on Earth, and they grow in different climates. So it's kind of perfect for, a mushroom farm that might have fluctuations in temperature. Maybe you focus heavily on the oysters that are high heat tolerant in the summer, and then you focus on the colder weather oysters in the winter. But what's cool about oysters is that they are known to produce novel antimicrobials. And what that means is you could literally take this compound and treat so-called incurable things with it on a petri dish, specifically MRSA or HPV. It's known to be effective against these things, which is mind-blowing. But it also has a very high amount of beta-glucans, right? So it's really good for the immunomodulatory system, your immune system in general, but it's also a great food for protein. I think it was oysters, but 9 out of 10 meat eaters that were tested from eating mushrooms versus meat were more satiated from eating oyster mushrooms than they were from eating meat. So it's a pretty good mushroom to introduce to a meat eater who's maybe skeptical or doesn't really believe that they can be satiated without eating something like meat. Cordyceps is a very unique and interesting mushroom. Last I checked, we have identified over 700-ish different species of cordyceps. Each species of cordyceps has this ability to be a parasite, if you will, on a certain insect or range of insects. And in the common everyday language, this word parasite is negative. But in my world, in the ecology world, it's something that's beneficial. It's a biodiversity generator. And just a quick recap on biodiversity, it's literally just the measurement of the amount of genetics in an ecosystem. The more genetics variation, so different species that you have in an ecosystem, the healthier that system is. It's more productive, it's more able to withstand attacks, it's more able to prevent infections. It's just all around a more productive space. Now, when you have a group of insects that come in and they are invasive or they are native, but they start driving down other species, so they start over-consuming their one food, which starts messing with the food web. It starts throwing in a little bit of a chaos, but the end result is biodiversity starts going down, which is bad. So cordyceps is a mushroom that comes in from a top-down control, drops spores, and these spores are able to penetrate the exoskeleton of certain insect species. And then it's not necessarily a mind control, but it hijacks the central nervous system, and it makes the insect feel a certain way. And somehow, unknown to myself and most of science, it's able to make the insect feel a very specific way to where it climbs up directly above the insect colony, latch its pincers into a bottom section of a leaf, per se, and it kills it. But it uses that connection to draw nutrients out of the leaf that it's attached to grow its fruiting body out of the base of the neck of the insect that it infected. And then it drops spores directly on top of the colony of which it's trying to remove to help create more biodiversity in that system. Now, when we talk about not all of these cordyceps species are known to be functional or medicinal in any sense. There are two that I know of that come to mind, and the traditional mushroom that we're familiar with is Cordyceps cyanescens. I believe it's been renamed to Ophiocordyceps cyanescens. And why it had to get renamed is because you cannot grow this mushroom. It's considered a compound species. It's very similar to a lichen. Right, so a lichen is made up of a fungal, a yeast, and an algal cell, and you need all three of these together to create the lichen. You can't take them apart and have a lichen, and you can't take them individually, put them together, and create a lichen. We don't know how to do that. And Cordyceps cyanescens is the exact same way. It's a compound species between 2 or 3 other species of organisms, and they work in consortium in the infected insect. And it's that arms race between the 2 or 3 species as it grows through the insect that produces the medicinal compounds. And what that really means is that we do not know how to do this in an artificial setting. We do not know how to grow Cordyceps cyanescens, but we do know how to grow Cordyceps militaris. And why these two mushrooms have been used traditionally and why they're well known today is they're considered the energy mushroom. And if you break it down to the cellular biology level, you have a mitochondria in every cell. And the mitochondria, most people, when I ask to finish my sentence, they can. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. We all had to memorize that in science class, but let's put some context to that. So the mitochondria, being the powerhouse of the cell, it uses a certain substance to create energy in the body. And I'm able to communicate, move my hands while I talk, anything at all because of the mitochondria, which we get from the XX chromosome. So thank your mom and all of the females in your life for that, because you wouldn't be alive without it. But it uses something called ATP synthase, which is adenosine triphosphate. And it basically breaks this compound apart to create energy in your cells. So cordyceps has a compound in it called cordycepin. And this, if you took a molecular structure of cordycepin and you compared it to adenosine, they would be virtually identical. So what this means is when you consume this mushroom, you can enhance your metabolic pathways. And what does this look like? So with clinical research with cyclists, you see an enhanced VO2 max. And all that really means is if you hike, bike, run, exercise at all, and you get winded, you can take cordyceps and you can move that wind wall a bit. So you have to work with it and take it on a daily basis, but you're able to move your wind wall and get more energy out of your day, out of your workout. And you don't have to be an endurance athlete to get the benefit, honestly. You can be someone who's just working long hours, and you maybe don't want to take caffeine. You can use cordyceps over a long period of time to get more energy out of your day-to-day life. They produce an array of compounds that not only help with energy, but they have this. They also have the immunomodulatory benefit. They're considered neuroprotective, and they have benchtop studies when they looked at cancer cells. Some cordyceps compounds have this ability to cleave off the reproductive mechanism of certain cancer cells, so it does have some promise in the cancer research realm, which I know there are some studies going on right now. Now, you cannot grow cordyceps sinensis, but you can wild harvest it. It only grows in a certain region of the world at a certain elevation, and unfortunately what that means with us is that we will unsustainably over-harvest anything, really, and that's what's happening with cordyceps sinensis. It's also worth more than its weight in gold per kilo, so it's a very expensive mushroom. Now, Cordyceps militaris has basically the exact same array of compounds in it, and because of our ability to work with genetics, we're able to get higher concentrations of these. And we have trained it to be gluten-free and vegan, so no insects were ever harmed in the growing of cordyceps, which allows us to really create a high-quality cordyceps product for a fraction of the cost in a very sustainable sense. Yeah, so I'm definitely an amateur fermenter, if you will. I learned how to do it usually from what I could read. Sandor Katz is a great resource. But fermentation in general is literally using microbes, specifically lactobacillus, but it's not just lactobacillus. There's a whole array of potential microbes that you can use, including some yeasts, as well as other fungi, to really take a carbon source like a sugar and break it down and produce more of itself, which tends to be healthy when consumed by the individual. You can also do this with food or in what's considered a symbiotic colony of different consortium of microbes, specifically bacteria, lactobacillus, and yeast, which what's really cool is one produces the alcohol and the other one kind of eats it. So that's kind of interesting, but that's the bacteria-yeast relationship. But it's in this consortium of which they're able to deconstruct certain complex structures as well as replicate and produce more of themselves. And they tend to be very healthy for the human gut. I guess not necessarily human gut, but probably mammal gut or any sort of animal that eats anything. So I'm also not a meat eater, but understanding and thinking about the evolution of fire and the importance of fire, I do think it's unfortunate that fermentation got set to the side, because I do feel that the evolution of the human brain, as well as getting more sustenance from your foods, could possibly have actually come earlier than fire, and it could have been through fermentations. By using probiotic cultures like lactobacillus and yeast, you're able to break down really complex plants to alleviate the nutrients that are inside without having to cook them. So in fermentation sense, it's basically slow cooking something at a low temperature. So it takes a lot longer in the time frame, but a lot longer would be, instead of, 10 minutes or an hour to cook something using fire, maybe this takes about a week. Or longer, kombucha can take up to 2 weeks. But when you ferment out something like cabbage and get sauerkraut, and you can literally apply this to any plant, and break it down to where it's more bioavailable in a nutrient sense to the human consumer. Yeah, one probiotic that I think I might know a little bit more about, maybe not, maybe I'll cover two, is water kefir or kefir. I'm not sure the pronunciation there. People call it kefir. I've heard kefir. But I found water kefir after kombucha. And what drew me to this, again, was the nootropics. And it turns out that water kefir produces certain microbes that have this ability to help promote NGF, or the nerve growth factor, as well, by being in your gut. And I guess I got to that world through kombucha. And really what's going on here is you have this alien substance of which nobody can agree on where it came from, that lives on forever as long as you take care of it. And it's literally called a SCOBY. It looks like a little gelatinous polysaccharide matrix, like a slimy pancake, if you will. It's very alien, honestly, but that's what drew me to it. I thought it was really cool. But this symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast called a SCOBY can take tannins from tea as well as sugars from any sort of simple sugar, break it down until it's basically very simple amino acids, and it's able to replicate by producing more scobies, but as well as lactobacillus, lactic acid specifically. And when ingested, I don't know, honestly, the health implications if it's needed on a daily basis, but personally, I started craving the flavor over time after climbing or doing some sort of workout. My reward to myself was a kombucha. Yes, I would have to say, so what's my favorite mushroom and why? Definitely lion's mane because of the nootropic quality of this mushroom. But one of my favorite mushrooms is antler reishi, just because it really encompasses my philosophy on my life. I like to have one foot deeply rooted in science, but then I believe when you're a mushroom farmer, you have to have an open mind. So I like to have one foot in mysticism. And I think antler reishi does that very well. And I guess why I think that is because antler reishi has been found in archaeological graves, either whether they were shamans or Buddhists, but it'll be adorned as jewelry. And traditionally, antler reishi was consumed as a grounding ceremonial mushroom because it helps ground the individual. And then science comes along, breaks down antler reishi, and finds, hey, this is a calming mushroom. It produces very specific compounds that have this anti-anxiety effect on the consumer after it's consumed. And I think that's a good example of where mysticism and science kind of join. And I think it's a very interesting and beautiful place to live.